Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk of the Progress and Visions in Consciousness Science online seminar series. This series is organised jointly by the Association for Mathematical Consciousness Science, AMCS, the Mediterranean Society for Consciousness Science, and the Oxford Mathematics of Consciousness Network. While every session consists of a talk and discussions, the latter are not recorded and the following will only contain the talk. We hope you will enjoy it. Further information and details on how to join are available on our website.
It is my honor to introduce Carlos Montemayor. Carlos is a professor of philosophy at San Francisco State University, where he co-created the graduate certificate in ethical artificial intelligence, which is how I first met him. Carlos's books on consciousness include Consciousness, Attention, and Conscious Attention, co-authored with Harry Halagian, and Knowledge, Dexterity, and Attention, co-authored with Avril Fairweather. And his latest book is The Prospect of a Humanitarian Artificial Intelligence, which is available for open access download. The title of his talk today is Scientific Constraints on Contemporary Theories of Consciousness. Please join me in welcoming Carlos Montemayor.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin, and everyone for being here and for organizing this very important series of talks on, on consciousness. I will, try to talk for 45 to 50 minutes. I think the emphasis of this, please let me know too if there's a problem. There's a link to it. If there's a problem or you can't see something, just feel free to interrupt if anything comes up. Okay. So I'm going to talk mostly about issues related to the evolution of consciousness, but I think just in general, how to constrain, what constraints are there on a theory of consciousness that I think are really important to discuss a lot more. So I will very briefly talk about the so-called heart problem, but I think this problem has been overemphasized and has dominated the literature for too long, and it has created a lot of confusion and problems. And although it is an enormous difficulty, and I'm not saying it's not a difficulty, we need to be focusing on other things as well. And especially now that some of the proponents of the heart problem, David Chalmers, are saying now that, for example, robots will be conscious and things that are problematic for various reasons. But the emphasis here is going to be on evolution and information. And the way I've been approaching this issue is by there's a little bit of echo. Thanks. So the way I've been approaching this issue is by studying attention and the evolution of attention with respect to consciousness. So there, just quickly, there's a bunch of preliminary questions here. Thomas Nagel, in his very, very seminal paper of 1974, What is it like to be a bat? That paper, the most important question of that paper was, can there be a science of consciousness? Nagel is very uncertain about how to answer this question. Dave Chalmers later, a little bit uncharitably, says that he is borderline incoherent in his answer. But the reason is, Nagel says we don't know how to develop a science of consciousness. That doesn't mean that consciousness is something non-material or beyond scientific exploration, but precisely because consciousness is what is it like for an organism to be that organism. We just don't have the right scientific approach, because all science is third-person perspectival, and the science of consciousness requires first-person perspective. I don't want to bore you with the details, other details that he mentions there, but one of the things he mentions that is very important is that consciousness has content, of course, and there can be bridges between what he calls an objective phenomenology and some kind of science. And that is related to some issues about information that I'll be talking about. So, so again, Nagel says we just can't even conceive of a science of consciousness right now, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. But of course, one of the big clues is going to be a biological phenomenon, because what is it like to be conscious is not for any robot or a matrix to be conscious. It's for organisms to be conscious, at least in the Nagel traditional orthodox definition. And of course, biology is going to be a constraint there, and information processing, whatever that means. These are questions that relate to how exactly attention is related to consciousness. How exactly is it that consciousness differs from other components of the mind? Consciousness can be dissociated from attention. That's some of the work that I've been doing. It can also be very different from intelligence. And from a metaphysical question, the idea is what exactly is consciousness? The so-called value question is what is the epistemic or moral value of consciousness? And all of these are related, but the idea is these questions, for them to be scientifically addressed, some constraints need to be in place. In the literature, something that is interesting is that most people think that attention is necessary for consciousness, although then it's not clear what else they think. So for example, some people say attention is necessary for content to enter into consciousness, but then consciousness is doubly dissociated from attention. This is something that, for example, Christoph Koch says, right? So he thinks that attention is, you can pay attention without being aware, phenomenally conscious, and you can have phenomenal consciousness without attention. But then the question is, how exactly should we understand the claim that it is through attention that consciousness gets the contents that it gets? Or, I mean, if there's other pictures here, if consciousness is more primitive and then attention operates on consciousness, what exactly is the relation there? So that's another problem. But most people think attention is prior, informationally speaking, and then consciousness operates on I mean, it's what is it like to have certain contents that are processed early on by attention. On some views, I mean, I know that Claire Sargent is going to speak to your group. The one way of understanding this claim is that the early processing of signals that compete against each other through attention, then the process information, attention is the early signal detection that is performed at the perception of the entry levels, and then that information gets broadcast in a neural global workspace. So attention that is attended to becomes conscious by boosting the signal. On other views, the consciousness is the integration, right? This is IIT, the integration of information that is irreducible to component parts, which can be understood modularly in terms of attention processing, right? So here too, attention operates first, then there's the integration of the substrate, and then that gets integrated, but again, attention is playing an essential role at the early stages. In the higher order theories, attention is attended to at the first order level. On some versions of the higher order theory, you can actually be consciously attending, but you won't be, you can have experiences with certain quality that you're attending to, but you won't be conscious of them until they're embedded in a higher order thought or a higher order representation. There's other views about reentrant information, and all of them require some degree of attention. That's the point. And attention is something that you can understand through functionalism. So the idea that attention is a kind of computation, or it has an algorithmic structure. It starts at an input state, processes information, there's an output state. There's a structure of selection for action, cognitive processing. These are definitions in the literature: the selection by a subject, or it's a kind of intentional mental action, some kind of coordinated information processing. But in all definitions, attention is related to information processing of a kind that we can easily articulate, right? So through some algorithmic structure or some kind of input-output structure, some kind of process guided through selection. And this is important because attention is much better understood in terms of function and in neuroscience than phenomenal consciousness, where we have many theories that appeal to very different areas of the brain. They're mutually incompatible with one another. They're kind of incommensurable with one another. But with attention, it's a very difficult issue. It's a very different issue, sorry. So this is all I want to say quickly about the hard problem, which is that attention should be a constraint on how we understand what makes it so hard to understand consciousness, right? So because if attention is operating with consciousness, there must be some constraints, right? So according to the hard problem, consciousness cannot be defined functionally, right? So it cannot be defined in terms of attention using the language that I'm using. This is based on Frank Jackson's Mary case, but also the hard problem as presented by David Chalmers through his philosophical zombie scenario. Identical replicas of you that behave and are indistinguishable physically from you minus consciousness. And Chalmers insisted, and many people accepted this, that these scenarios are conceivable and that makes them somehow possible. And of course, people like Daniel Dennett from the very beginning said, no, this is not even conceivable, because without biological constraints, I don't know what it means that you can have an identical biological organism, but that lacks this very important cognitive function of consciousness. So in terms of attention, what is weird is that what this means is that a creature could have the same attention routines and be as intelligent, but not have any awareness of what it's doing. And so on one version of the hard problem, it's easy to see that you can have a philosophical zombie and not have consciousness. But in the reverse engineered version, it is very hard to see how an organism that has the same ways of paying attention, the same ways of reporting content, would lack any of the corresponding qualia or phenomenal consciousness, or what is it like. And here, of course, the idea is that a part of what makes the qualitative character experience specific is that the way we pay attention is also specific. So there has to be some kind of relation here. And David Lewis, in a very good paper he wrote on Frank Jackson's Mary thought experiment, where Lewis ends up rejecting the view that consciousness is non-physical. He called this the puzzle of information, where the idea is you have the standard notion of information, and all of a sudden Mary seems to learn new information. But the more you try to define the kind of information Mary learns, the more mystical it gets. It just seems to be something that cannot be understood in terms of recipes or things you can write on paper. David Lewis's solution is that Mary learns something about how to process contents, not about which contents she's processing, and that there's a lot to say about that interpretation, that Mary learns how to relate to the world and to connect to the world rather than a new content. This comes up a lot in the literature, and just I don't want to get a lot into this, but this is kind of rather fundamental for IIT, because they claim that the standard Shannonian way notion of information is not really the notion that you need for the intrinsicality of information. They go back and forth about this, but the idea is that there's a kind of functionalist, purely causal explanation of information processing, and that integrated information is different, right? So one thing that I want to emphasize, I mean, these are all papers, Perry and Lewis, on how you can have indexicality without qualitative character. But the idea is no notion of information that can be spelled out clearly mathematically obviously entails phenomenality, right? It entails that there is something it is like to process the information. Of course, one of the exceptions is IIT, which assumes that phenomenality is an axiom and that there is a kind of information that is essentially conscious. But you can look at it from the side of attention and the contents of attention, or from the side of information theory, and you face this problem that consciousness is supposed to present this obstacle to how further scientific investigation can process. But in both cases, you want to say, well, clearly the solution cannot be that consciousness is completely divorced from how an organism attends to the environment, and clearly cannot be completely devoid of information. So we should look at constraints here, and we need to identify how attention differs from consciousness as part of the science of consciousness. And maybe we want to consider different forms of dissociation, how much consciousness can be completely independent from attention. But I think one of the key ingredients here, one of the key constraints, should be considerations about the evolution of different kinds of attention, and which of those are more related to the subjectivity and the phenomenal character of consciousness. This is from the book that Justin showed you, the Consciousness, Attention, and Conscious Attention. And the idea is that in animal cognition, you have a lot of forms of signal detection. Signal detection, some people want to extend even to plants and their circadian rhythms and their sensitivities to light, but clearly very basic sensory receptors, feature-based attention, spatial attention, animal monitoring. I mean, you can go. So this red arrow is supposed to be very important aspects of our evolution, in a cognitive evolution, without which we would not be able to navigate the complex environments we live in. And then as our evolution progressed and our intelligence progressed, we developed forms of attention that seem to be involved with very important kinds of self-awareness, some of them dependent on mind reading or the theory of mind, or some of them on language, which might be specific to humans, some of them much more complicated, like self-awareness, phenomenal character, or access and phenomenal consciousness, and that probably gives rise to specific forms of attention. But the idea is, it would be nice to have, this is just a proposal for a chart. It's obviously not very specific, and a lot of details need to be provided here. But this is the kind of thing that we should try to have in mind when we think of how evolution could shape different kinds of consciousness, and which kinds of consciousness we can find or identify in some animals, and what makes our kind of consciousness unique, and how to devise the hard problem into specific problems of types of attention and how they might relate to phenomenal character. And again, the idea of what would be the evolutionary point of consciousness. Here, no one really debates that attention evolved early, and it's a very important aspect of our evolution. Again, it can be dissociated from consciousness for this reason. If all types of attention are necessary for consciousness, and attention is the same as consciousness, that would mean that most animals are conscious just like us. Or if, on the other hand, phenomenal consciousness is completely different from attention, then that would not be very compatible with the evolution of consciousness. It would be rather mysterious why something evolved that is completely unrelated to the way we pay attention to the environment, unless you have a view like Nick Humphreys that consciousness is what makes our life interesting. And then the idea is, in terms of evolution, this is kind of a spandrel, and the real question we should be asking is not the hard problem, but what is the value of consciousness? What is it that we value about consciousness, other than how it relates to information processing and attention? So one way of making consciousness more tractable from a scientific point of view is this argument from shared contents. And the idea is that the epistemic status of consciousness, the fact that we can use consciousness to know things and report, is the publicly available ways of specifying the contents of our experiences. And that would not happen without somehow exercising some kind of joint attention. So the idea is, the contents of consciousness become reportable and are reportable because they are somehow connected to capacities for joint attention and attention. But if this is the case, then probably consciousness evolved as part of this enabling of attention for our own experiences and reporting them and reporting and identifying the reports of others. And so then some of it has to do with how we value consciousness. Some of it has to do with how we report it. And here again, one possibility is that some forms of consciousness really depend on how we're paying attention to the experience. Others will have value of their own, like aesthetic experiences of beauty or joy. But of course, these are things that need to be investigated. And again, there's a very strong, there are very strong reasons for believing that what philosophers call intentionality, or the contents of our mental states, are the result of evolution. One of them is to be a teleosemanticist, like Millikan, who thinks that unless you have evolution, then you don't have like ways of having goals in the system that could give grounds for the content of terms, and because you don't have that, you don't get semantics without something like evolution, or something like some kind of goal-oriented behavior and mental processing. And I don't want to read this whole argument, but the idea is that if perceptual systems evolve, then intentionality also evolved. The idea is these are signal detection processes that are guided, oriented towards the environment. If those evolve, that's how we get the idea of the aboutness of a mental state evolving alongside these sensorial capacities. And then if that's true, attention routines evolve in this way. And again, if you have the obsession of just thinking that the heart problem needs to also be addressed here, it's not clear that consciousness evolves in this way. And indeed, in the literature, we did a literature review, my co-author and I, and most people think that the evolution of consciousness is very problematic. And of course, this is a scientific problem. So one way of thinking about the relationship between attention and consciousness is to determine if consciousness is a recent adaptation. Attention can be given an adaptive story, but consciousness is not easy to describe as adaptive or as having a very specific functional role. So as I said, maybe something else is what makes consciousness interesting and important here. And in terms of information processing, it would need to be spelled out in terms of how it's uniquely connected to our homeostatic system. That's something I'm going to talk about briefly. That would make it not repeatable or not clonable in terms of information, but that needs to be spelled out more clearly. So in terms of attention, many animals are considered to have attention. There's many types of attention that you can find in insects, birds. And again, here the question is the same. Which of these types of attention is related to experience? Which are related to access consciousness, what Bloch calls access consciousness, which is reportability without what is it like to undergo the experience, and what is the value of these capacities? What are the values of these capacities? And so there is no consensus about the evolution of consciousness. And identifying consciousness is a lot more difficult. This is called the threshold problem, where is it that we draw the line between some species and us. I have an octopus here because a lot of researchers think that octopus are conscious in a way that we cannot possibly understand. But of course, octopus clearly pay attention to things. Some authors talk about consciousness even happening in insects, some of them talking about processing in the thalamus. I'm going to talk about the thalamus in a second, and some of them related to increased complexity, some even to the language capacity. And of course, that would mean that only we count as fully conscious if the language capacity is exclusive to us. You can think of this in terms of, I mean, this is one of the things I've done in the past in terms of time perception, and think of attention to time in terms of literally attention to duration, the visceral influence on time estimation, homeostasis, and just think of how much of time perception can happen unconsciously, and then what is the role of consciousness when you're conscious of time. And of course, here there's aspects of that where you can clearly see the influence of language, and even here it is not clear that conscious time perception is other than unifying our experience in a interesting continuous way. It's not clear that most of time perception could occur unconsciously, and in fact most of it occurs unconsciously. This 2023 paper is a paper with Haladian too on various puzzles about how to think about information, how attention and consciousness differ in terms of information, and the different what the difference series is. So, for example, if you think of the global workspace, it would seem like the global workspace says that it's the same information. It's just that now it's ramped up by a broadcast signal. Whereas for a view like IIT, the information changes. The character of the information changes because now it's highly integrated rather than what it was before. So the challenge is, okay, so which theories say that conscious information is dramatically different from information that is attended to, and what does that mean exactly? So that's basically what we say here. No current theories clarify the difference between attention and consciousness in terms of information. And this is important to advance the debate. We here propose that homeostatic processing is more deeply associated with biologically somehow encrypted information. And that's what makes consciousness unique and subjectively specifies. Okay. And now this is more recent work with Albert Naven at Bochum. It's talking more specifically about GNWT and IIT. There seems to be a neural challenge. Theories seem to ignore, the theories of consciousness, scientific theories of consciousness, seem to ignore the important role that neural processing, the brainstem for consciousness, plays in creating conscious awareness. There's a lot of evidence that comes from the work by Bjorn Merker, a couple of papers he wrote for BBS, one of them specifically targeting IIT, but also a book by Mark Solms on the importance of the thalamus and the basal ganglia for consciousness. Neither IIT nor GNW2 take into account this body of evidence. And interestingly, the whole area of minimal states of consciousness heavily rely on this thalamic research. So I think there's a neural disconnect here between different scientific theories of consciousness. This challenge is associated with the evolutionary challenge that I've been trying to articulate so far, which is that it remains unclear what the evolutionary role of consciousness is in these theories, right? Because if you say, well, it's the thalamic areas, then you can say, yeah, it's this regulatory, biometrical, homeostatic role. And of course, when as Mark Solms says, when your homeostasis goes wrong, you quickly get a very strong experience with phenomenal character, basically pain or pleasure if you recover homeostasis. So you get a valence structure that comes from this. That could be a clear evolutionary reason for consciousness to evolve. None of the theories, or scientific theories, emphasize this much other than these thalamic theories. And there is a conceptual phenomenological challenge, which is consciousness graded? Or can there be grades of consciousness, degrees of consciousness, minimal, more immediate, and then more sophisticated? or is it just a single yes or no kind of phenomenon? And again, different theories say different things about this. Here I'm focusing on GNWT and IIT, but these are challenges that relate to this information evolution challenge. Just very quickly, the reptilian brain is clearly not a very appropriate term anymore, but the idea is that these are different areas of the brain that evolve at different points, and the thalamus and the sort of the instinctual brain and how it talks to the limbic system is one of the oldest areas of the brain. As Christoph Koch likes to say a lot, the whole cerebellum, which is one of the most intricate, beautifully connected areas, is unconscious. You can remove entirely the cerebellum and you stay conscious. The frontal cortex, this is a claim that he makes against GNWT, can be removed and you preserve consciousness. So that's why they claim that this is the area, the hot spot area, where they think consciousness is. But what is important is the entire neocortex is what they emphasize. And of course, this area is not emphasized at all. And clearly, this is the area that connects with the homeostatic functions that evolved early on, which is important to explain the evolution of consciousness. So the idea from the thalamic perspective is that consciousness can be realized by the activation of evolutionarily old brain areas, the brainstem and the thalamus, and that this is independently of all neocortical activation. So all of the neocortex can be, according to this view, can be removed, and you keep some kind of minimal awareness. It would make sense of the early evolution of consciousness, but then we need to understand better how that differs from attention. And here, the evidence that Merker offers concerns hydroencephalic children without any neocortex that enjoys some kind of basic form of consciousness, according to him. There's also studies with cats with removed cortex that also react to the environment, pay attention, but also seem to be able to have conscious experiences. And there's also, of course, strong evidence that indicates that neocortical processes are relevant for conscious experiences. Of course, this is the work of the main proponents of GNWT and IIT. We, in this paper, Nathan and I, focus on a set of very, very recent findings that show that the thalamus is critically connected to functions of attention, and that the thalamus can operate as a switch, the way early work on pioneering work by Frick and even Christoph Koch worked on. And the idea is that the thalamus, especially a specific area of the thalamus called the cortical thalamic reticular area of the thalamus, projects to the frontal areas and projects also to the thalamus, and works as an off-on switch where you're aware of certain experiences through this switch, and it can be actually manipulated in mice. And this shows that the thalamus is a sort of entry point into a very basic form of arousal or very basic form of consciousness. This is a finding that is related to this Redingbaugh and colleagues finding. This is a very, very important paper. I think it was published in Nature, called The Role of Thalamic Reticular Nucleus in Conscious Attention. And the idea is that this switch in a dual task, attention to a sound and attention to vision, by manipulating the reticular nucleus, the mouse is either attending to one or the other, depending on what the connection to the thalamus is. Right? So there is activity in the frontal cortex, but what is critical for awareness to occur, or to conscious attention to occur, or you could say, well, maybe this is just about attention, but the idea is the animal seems to respond and be aware of the signal depending on this manipulation to the thalamus. Here, what we think is these are really interesting findings. And what we think is that on the one hand, consciousness is based on the activation of an evolutionary old brain area, in this case, this reticular part of the thalamus. And again, Merker and Solms may think that can happen independently of neocortical activations. But of course, there is a neocortical contribution because attention operates in the parietal lobes and in some of the frontal areas. And this would explain how attention in the neocortical areas can talk to and can be part of an older part of the brain that controls phenomenal consciousness. And so on the one hand, you have these very basic older areas that seem to be important for a kind of awareness. And then you have these new areas that seem to be important for integration processing. So what we propose is that by distinguishing two levels of phenomenal consciousness, which we call basic arousal and general alertness, general alertness is metacognitive and reflexive consciousness. Leaving aside metacognitive and reflexive consciousness, it is a kind of flexible sort of cognition that could solve this tension in the standard contemporary theories of consciousness. So the idea is that this set of constraints, the evolutionary constraints, the neural constraints, the evidential constraints, sort of all what we learn from the neuroscience of consciousness and attention, point in the direction that an account of consciousness should be able to describe plausible functional roles of consciousness, both from an evolutionary and a synchronic perspective. So in terms of what was the evolutionary purpose, but also what are the cognitive purposes of consciousness given a specific task. It should also account for the empirical evidence, and specifically these thalamic processes, and it needs to solve the tension between non-cortical and cortical theories. Non-cortical and neocortical theories, right? And so this is just a very brief sketch of what we propose in this theory that we call alarm. Again, alarm may not be the best term here, but we needed a term. And the idea is that for this theory, biological systems heavily rely on survival systems, homeostatic systems that are related to breath, temperature, nutrition, sleep, and survival circuits concerning fear, care, sex. That is something that Panksip has worked on quite a bit, and that the moderate increase of temperature triggers these signals, and that there's an activation of homeostatic regulation that the way we put it, it affects the normally slow Bayesian updating of information across the system. So another way of putting this is Joe Leduc's way of putting this is the amygdala is one of the tiniest areas of the brain, but once you enter the state of absolute freezing out of fear, it hijacks your entire brain, right? This is a very powerful survival system. And of course, it's associated with a very powerful phenomenology, the phenomenology of panicking fear, which has an extremely strong response in your homeostatic system. Or all these systems go into a very alarming, to use that term, state where your temperature increases, your breath increases, you can go days without sleep and nutrition. I mean, depending on how long the alarming situation is, the fearful situation is. And the idea is consciousness early evolved to trigger this signal in a way that could be stabilized later on by what we call general alertness. But the idea is this is not just an attention routine. It's something that plays a very basic role connected to your biological functioning. And it's a kind of connection to your biological stability. And that's why it's not really algorithmic. It's more homeostatic, the way Solms puts it. So again, the paper, we have an initial paper published in Journal of Conscious Studies, and we're currently working on a more ambitious paper where we're going to talk about information. But I can send you the paper if you're curious. It was published in Journal of Conscious Studies in 2023. And just to restate, the idea is that there's a basic algorithmic, we call it Bayesian here, updating of information, but conscious experience of the early kind hijacks this system and changes the weights and actually suspends this system. And then once you have a system with a frontal cortex and attention routines that can temper the very strong homeostatic signal, then you get a constant awareness that tells you that you're in good homeostatic shape that can be used for learning, for remembering experiences like pain in a new context, where you can use the experience itself as part of your learning and not the awful thing that happened in the past as a stimuli, right? So you can learn from your experience and its connection to your homeostatic functions rather than the original stimuli themselves. And of course, once you have this other stage of consciousness that connects frontal activation with the limbic system, you get other evolutionary advantages, like something I was saying, problem solving based simply on implicit learning and the quality of your experiences, and new types of possibilities on the basis of your experiences that you can recall and the qualitative character, the intensity of a pain, for example. So in a general way, and this is a little bit cryptic, so if you have questions for the Q&A, we can address them during the Q&A. The old function of consciousness would be this triggering system, and the newer function would be to accelerate specific kinds of learning through this kind of general alertness that depends on how the older areas talk to the frontal cortex, and that would make sense of this Halassa findings that the cortex talks to this reticular area of the thalamus and uses it as a switch. And here the idea is that this homeostatic function is a kind of familiarity with your own biology versus simple representational access to contents. So here there's a good reason to think that, taken from the evolutionary perspective, nature does not make a major jump. There seems to be levels of consciousness, at least these two basic and general levels. Here's a more detailed description of the neural processing perspective. There are dendrites that I didn't talk about here, but there's something called the dendritic integration theory, where there are some neurons that actually connect these areas of the neocortex with the hypothalamus and the brainstem, and they seem to do the kind of thing that we're suggesting in these two stages of conscious awareness. So to conclude, there are these two levels. If that's true, we propose that there's these two levels, and if that's true, there will be an easier way to understand how consciousness could happen without attentive processing, by alarming the entire system, hijacking the brain, if you want to put it that way, and then how other kinds of instantaneous problem solving operating through general alertness would really be forms of attention operating with consciousness, and how consciousness connects homeostatically to what we're doing at a point in time. Okay, that's it. Sorry if I was rushing too much. I really wanted to get to the conclusion. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.